Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, we've talked a lot, of course, about Kiev having, for all intents and purposes, lost on the battlefield. But now they and some of their allies appear to be shifting tactics to focus on a scorched earth policy against Russia and even some of Europe's energy infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is not really a unique development. There has been sporadic attacks in the past, uh, but this has added gravitas simply on the basis that, in light of recent talks that have gone on between the US and Ukraine, between the US and Russia, and the United States and Europe, it's very obvious, including the US military, as we said previously, who've told the Ukrainians the war's over. You cannot turn the tide. You've lost the war. We can't provide you with munitions. Russia can fight this war indefinitely. You need to cut your losses and end it yesterday, preferably. And of course, they don't want to do this because there are elements in Ukraine who've profited enormously from this war and want to continue to do so. The same applies to Europe. And in their desperation and the realization that they cannot win the war and they can't even prevent Russia making significant gains, it's not like they can mire them in a sort of status of not being able to make any further gains. So it becomes a war of attrition that literally it's immovable objects. That no longer applies either. And it's very interesting to note that there were statements made by the Belgian Prime Minister who said no one believes Russia will be defeated with respect to Ukraine. So whilst they'll publicly make all the right noises and claim, that Russia's the reason why these peace talks aren't working and we must keep arming Ukraine, they know it's a futile gesture. They know they haven't got the arms to give to Ukraine, that they're bankrupt and can't finance Ukraine, even going to the extent of trying to get the European Central Bank involved, who categorically stated, we are not going to backstop any loan payment given to Ukraine. This is just simply not going to happen. This relates to, of course, this desire to steal frozen Russian assets that's really fallen by the wayside because the Belgians won't agree to it. Euroclear won't agree to it because it's illegal under international law, even though elements in the European Commission clearly think they're above the law. And then, of course, von der Leyen came out today and talked about that Europe's closing the tap on Russian fossil fuels once and for all, on our energy independence starts now. Independence from who? Because Europe has total energy dependence on someone. But this is all just an act of desperation. And in an act of desperation, the risk always was that Ukraine would be given the incentive to conduct what I think is very fairly scorched earth tactics. And we've noticed in the last few days that multiple tankers linked to Russia, which is supposed to be part of Russia's shadow fleet, whether they are or not is an entirely different question, but they've been struck in the Black Sea or off the Turkish coast by naval drones that were launched by the SBU, which is the security service of Ukraine. There was two that were targeted. Apparently they were empty, but they suffered severe damage and they're out of service. There was a third tanker that was carrying cargo from Russia to Georgia, and it was attacked off the coast of Turkey. The crew were unharmed, but the vessel is continued under its own power. But Turkish authorities said it was a kamikaze drone strike. Erdogan is very upset about this because it's getting too close to Turkey, and it's a obviously the Black Sea and the Bosphorus Strait are very key in terms of being able to transport goods from not just obviously Russia and Ukraine in this example, but other European countries, including Turkey, of course. So, is this likely to continue and become a more permanent feature if the Ukrainians are planning these scorched earth tactics, which increasingly seems they are? Well, yes, because they think this is going to disrupt Russia's ability to export goods, and it's going to impact their ability to profit from oil exports, etc., even though it's just completely fundamentally flawed thinking. But these strikes are being carried out near the territorial waters of Turkey, so no wonder Turkey's furious about it. I mean, and therefore, what else is Ukraine planning? What I mean, are they then going to go for the Crimean Bridge again? Are they going to start attacking or trying to attack specific targets inside Russia itself? I'm not talking about Donetsk and Lugansk, which are contested regions of Russia. I'm talking about what was the Russian Federation pre the start of the war in February 2022. Obviously, there are other developments, but I'll park that so Ken can obviously speak as well.
Yeah, there was, one of the things that is really shifting is obviously we have seen drone attacks and other types of attacks on Russian refineries, Russian attempts at Russian oil tankers, and then, of course, pipelines or other hubs along the way. Now it appears even more because a month ago there was an attack that was minimal, but it was enough to threaten oil going into the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and anything along the southern Druzhba pipeline. Now, last night, that attack was no longer minimal. It was a series of attacks that potentially struck at the main important energy artery that goes from Russia through Belarus, Ukraine, and into Central Europe. So, whether it's being done by Kiev itself, whether it's being done by intelligence services working with Kiev, either way, we're starting to see now where the war is suddenly being brought to the forefront of Europe. And the question that really has to be asked is if you are relying upon Europe to fund and arm your conflict, why would you stab your allies in the back?
Yeah, but the reason for attacking it is because Hungary and Slovakia are not pro-financing Ukraine anymore, and they're trying to cause Hungary and Slovakia enormous amounts of economic financial damage by attacking the pipeline. Because bear in mind, this has a capacity of about 2 million barrels per day. But it was coordinated. They used remote controlled explosives in this latest attack of the Druzhba oil pipeline to destroy the oil pipeline section. Now, as Ken rightly says, there was other attacks in August, but this is definitely trying to put maximum pressure on the Hungarians and the Slovakians to toe the line. But the question is, who is ultimately behind this? Is it just the Ukrainians? Are the Europeans involved? Is the UK involved? I very much doubt the Americans are involved in any way, shape, or form. But where is this going to end? And it then ties in with another development where, when it comes to these negotiations, now people can agree or disagree. That's beside the point. But Putin made this statement after there was talks between the Russians and Witkoff was there and Kushner, where he launched this attack against Europe, saying, that its counter-peace proposals were totally unacceptable to Russia. No surprise. And he said, we're not going to war with Europe. I've said it 100 times. But if Europe wants to fight us, because there's been ridiculous comments coming out of European countries going, we should have some preemptive strikes on Russia because of their conduct and behavior. I mean, it's just nonsensical, idiotic, and it's not going to happen. But he said if Europe wants a fight, we're ready for it. Because Europe's really fed up that in terms of talks between the Ukraine and the US and the US and Russia, they've been excluded completely, whether it's directly in talks or with respect to peace plans or discussions between obviously what's been said between the Russians and the Americans. And then Callas came out and said, Russia doesn't want peace and we need to make Ukraine as strong as possible. Well, how any of them actually, given they know privately, Ukraine is finished, it cannot fight this war anymore. Why do they keep making these noises? Well, it comes back to the point that there are elements in the West who have profited enormously from this war, as there are in people in Ukraine. And they don't want the war to end. They want the war to carry on as long as possible so they can maximize profits and take advantage of what I'm going to appallingly name a gravy train. I mean, how much money is being stolen and embezzled and it is debatable, but probably 100 billion maybe. Where's it gone? Who's got it? I mean, we're not going to name names because we don't know. And also, frankly, it's rather reckless to do so. But clearly, there are elements inside Europe, including the UK, who want this war to carry on. So they want this scorched earth tactics because it just keeps the war going a bit longer. But they must, as well as privately, and knowing full well it's over, are now starting amongst themselves to have to admit, hence the Belgian Prime Minister coming out and making such a public statement, the war's over. But in the meantime, what is Ukraine going to continue to do and who's it doing it in conjunction with? And at what point is the Americans going to turn around and get really fed up with it as well? And I don't think we're far off that. And the question is, what would the United States consider doing if it really does believe, which I think it does, that it's Ukraine who's preventing the war ending? But what can they do? I mean, then it becomes a very difficult situation. But there's no doubt there are elements in Europe who just don't want this war to end. They'd like it to drag on and on and on. And in their desperation, they might be inclined to do idiotic things, as well as encouraging or aiding and abetting Ukraine doing idiotic things. And the question is, at what point does the patience with Russia snap? And maybe they decide enough's enough and we're now going to change it from an SMO to a war. And if that happens, and we've said this before, it's the last thing that needs to happen because the Ukrainian people will suffer enormously. And then the clowns in the Western world will see what a real war is and how Russia has fought the Ukraine war at about 20 or 30% of its actual capacity. Something you just cannot get through the thick skulls, and I'm using those terms, of clowns in Europe who just simply will not accept that this is not a war and that Russia has not fought a clinical war with no ramifications or consideration for their actions. But don't push them because they might just do that.
I think one of the things that stands out, of course, is this sabotage takes place at exactly when peace talks are occurring between Russia and the United States. And of course, it was shortly after there were talks between the U.S. and Ukraine that really came to no type of fruition at all. And we also have, the belief, the understanding at least, or I don't want to say the confirmation, but the inference that Russia understands that some of the attacks that are occurring on its shadow fleet are not just from Europe. Putin came out and said that Russia is ready for war against Europe if attacks on the Russian tankers and energy infrastructure continue. So they must have evidence that they believe that while it may be being done by Ukrainian arms, it could be logistically being uh, done by agencies within Europe. The other thing I want to take a look at is if Ukraine is continuously focusing not on the battlefield and not on trying to defend the country, but instead doing these, uh, you know, random attacks on infrastructure, etc. When a quote unquote peace agreement does finally come about, who's to say that these types of attacks are not going to continue in a more covert or, you know, intelligence-based, type of scenario? Because there is going to be long-standing animosity when Kiev is forced to the signing table, and likely if they don't completely eradicate the elements within the government, then these type of attacks are going to continue and continue infinitum.
Yeah, and that's the well, we're back to that point. How do you end the war so it actually ends and you're not just basically implementing something akin to a permanent ceasefire that can reignite in the blink of an eye? That's a whole separate subject, and we don't need to discuss that again. But you're absolutely right, and that is the big problem because that kind of what people might term insurgency could continue. And then how is that dealt with? And therefore, this is not just a situation of ending the war, but ending the war in a way that it actually has lasting peace. And at the moment, we continue to be a million miles away from resolving that problem.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts you wanted to add to this, Paul?
No, I think that's fine.
To everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.